I always knew there was a basement in my house, but I never went down there. It was as if something was keeping me upstairs, away from that dark, dusty space. My parents also avoided talking about it, as if even mentioning it could awaken something dark and sinister. As a child, I often heard strange sounds coming from beneath the floor. They sounded like rustling, creaking, and sometimes quiet tapping. I asked my parents what it was, but they always brushed it off, saying it was just the old house living its life. But I knew it was something more. Over the years, I learned to ignore those sounds, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. It felt as if the basement was breathing, like a living being, emitting sighs and soft moans. I tried not to pay attention, but the older I got, the stronger the urge to find out what was down there became. One night, when I was already an adult, the sounds became unbearable. It was deep winter, a blizzard was raging outside, and the house felt especially empty and cold. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed, and the sounds grew louder. The creak of doors, rustling, as if someone was slowly climbing the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely hear anything else. Suddenly, I realized I couldn't bear it any longer. I had to find out what was there. I got out of bed, threw on a robe, and quietly crept down the hallway. The basement was waiting for me below, like a dark, sinister maw. The basement door creaked as I opened it. A sharp smell of dampness and mold hit my nose. For a moment, I froze, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I wanted to go back to the warmth and comfort of my room, but I couldn't. Some force was pulling me down. I found an old flashlight on the shelf by the door and slowly began descending the steps. They were ancient, eaten away by time and moisture. Each step echoed with a dull creak. The flashlight shone dimly, barely piercing the darkness, but I kept going. The basement was large and seemed endless. The walls, covered in mold, were draped with old cobwebs. In the corners stood old, forgotten things, covered with a thick layer of dust. I passed them by, feeling the air grow heavier and colder. Suddenly, I heard a sound that froze my blood. It was a quiet, barely discernible whisper. I stopped, trying to locate its source. The whisper grew louder, and soon I realized it was coming from the deepest corner of the basement. I took a few steps towards that corner, and my feet sank into some sticky, viscous substance. The flashlight revealed an old chest standing against the wall. It was covered in dust and mold, but seemed strangely alive, as if it was pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The whisper grew louder, and I felt cold sweat running down my forehead. It seemed like the sound was coming from inside the chest. My body trembled with fear, but I couldn't stop. I approached it and cautiously reached for the lock. The lock was old, rusty, and looked long forgotten. I managed to turn it with difficulty, and with a quiet creak, it opened. At that moment, the whisper fell silent, and a dead silence filled the basement. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I slowly lifted the lid of the chest, and the flashlight illuminated its contents. Inside lay old, worn-out dolls, covered in dust and cobwebs. Their eyes, once bright and cheerful, now seemed empty and sinister. One of the dolls was missing an eye, and its face was disfigured by time. But something about it drew my gaze. I leaned closer, trying to make out the details, and suddenly felt an icy wind blow from the depths of the chest. The wind was so cold that I instinctively recoiled. The flashlight slipped from my hand and fell to the floor, rolling under an old table. The basement was plunged into darkness, and only a faint light from the moon, filtering through a small window, gave me a point of reference. At that moment, I heard a quiet, barely audible child's laugh. It came from somewhere behind me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't dare to turn around, but I knew I wasn't alone in the basement. The laugh grew louder, and I heard tiny footsteps begin to patter across the floor. The sounds drew closer to me, and I felt my legs freeze in fear. But suddenly, everything went silent. I stood in complete silence, not daring to move. Suddenly, something cold and wet touched my hand. I screamed and jerked it away. The basement echoed with my scream, and at that moment, the flashlight flickered back on, illuminating the corner of the basement. Where the chest had stood just a few minutes ago, there was now a deep hole, emitting a dark, sinister light. A thick fog was rising from the hole, enveloping everything around. I felt my legs start to give way. I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I ran towards the stairs, but the basement began to change. The walls shifted, as if alive, blocking my path. I could hear a sinister whisper echoing from the depths of the basement behind me. The staircase leading up seemed endlessly far away. I was almost there when I heard something move behind me. I turned around and saw a dark figure rising from the hole in the floor. This figure was so terrifying that I couldn't look away. Its eyes glowed red, and thick fog poured from its mouth. It slowly approached me, and I felt each step resonate with icy horror in my heart. The figure reached out its hand towards me, and I felt the air around me grow heavy and cold. I knew that if it touched me, I wouldn't be able to escape its grip. In desperation, I lunged towards the stairs. My legs barely obeyed me, but I kept running. Each movement was a struggle, as if I was running through thick, sticky molasses. But I couldn't stop. I knew that if I slowed down, I would never escape. When I finally reached the stairs, I heard a loud, piercing scream behind me. The scream was filled with hatred and malice. I knew the figure was chasing me, and if I didn't make it upstairs, I would be lost forever. I began climbing the stairs, feeling each step echo painfully through my body. The stairs creaked and swayed beneath my feet, but I couldn't stop. A heavy, sinister rustling sounded below. When I reached the top step, I looked back one last time. The dark figure stood below, staring straight at me. Its eyes burned with rage, and I knew that if I opened the door, it would try to follow me. I pushed the door with such force that it flew open, and I ran upstairs, slamming it shut behind me. At that moment, I heard something heavy slam against the door from the other side. I pressed myself against the door, trying to keep it closed. The sounds behind the door gradually faded, and I, breathing heavily, tried to gather my thoughts. But now I knew that the basement was not just an abandoned space. It hid something ancient and sinister, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. I stepped away from the door, feeling a shiver run through my entire body. The basement was closed, but I knew this wasn't the end. I realized that the darkness lurking there would find a way to escape, and it wouldn't stop until it achieved its goal. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle, every creak made me flinch. I listened to the sounds of the house, expecting at any moment to hear whispers or footsteps again. But the night passed in silence, and I began to doubt that it had all been real. The next day, I decided to seal the basement shut. I boarded up the door with wooden planks and locked it. But even after that, I didn't feel safe. It seemed that the basement's darkness was still present in the house, in every corner, in every dark nook. Days, weeks, and months passed. I tried not to think about the basement, not to remember what happened that night. But each day it became harder. The darkness began to invade my dreams, my thoughts, giving me no peace. One night I heard something tapping on the basement door. It was a light, barely audible knock, but I knew what it meant. The darkness I had tried to seal away was looking for a way out. I felt a chill of fear run down my spine. I approached the door, my heart pounding so hard that I thought it might stop. I knew I couldn't open it, but ignoring the knocking was also impossible. The knocking grew louder, and I realized I would have to face whatever the basement was hiding. I stood before the door, hesitating, not knowing what to do. The knocking intensified. It was insistent and demanding. I felt the force behind the door growing stronger, becoming more palpable. It was clear that it wouldn't leave just like that. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but none offered a safe way out. My hand reached for the lock, even though I knew opening that door would be madness. But something, some invisible force, was compelling me to do it. The lock clicked, and I felt my heart stop. I froze, listening, but there was silence all around. However, behind the door, behind those few centimeters of wood, I felt the presence of something sinister, something waiting for its moment. At that moment, something inside me broke, and I realized I had to end this once and for all. I resolutely grabbed the handle and forcefully threw the door open. Cold air hit my face, and I felt the basement's darkness envelop me. But instead of going down, I saw a misty figure begin to rise from the basement's darkness. It was barely visible, almost transparent, but its sinister aura was palpable. I stepped back, unable to take my eyes off it. The figure slowly approached me, its silhouette becoming more defined. I felt growing fear, but I couldn't move. as if my feet were glued to the floor. It reached out to me, and I felt cold engulf my entire body. But suddenly the figure stopped. In its eyes, which glowed with a dark, malevolent light, there was a flicker of doubt. I realized that the fear it instilled gave it strength, and if I didn't give in to that fear, I could stand my ground. Gathering all my willpower, I took a step forward, gritting my teeth. The figure froze, its outlines starting to blur, as if it was losing its power. I understood that victory was in my hands if I didn't allow myself to break. I took another step, and the figure began to retreat, its contours becoming more and more indistinct. The fog in the basement started to dissipate, and the darkness seemed to lose its strength. I felt the air around me become lighter, as if the heaviness that had hung over the house was finally lifting. And then, in a moment, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the air. The basement plunged back into darkness, but now it was ordinary darkness, without the sinister force that had tormented me for so many years. I closed the door, this time confidently, and turned the key in the lock. Silence filled the house. I stood, breathing heavily, realizing that I had won. The house no longer seemed so frightening, and although the basement was still a scary place, I knew that the evil lurking there could no longer harm me. I returned to my room, feeling tired, but with the fatigue came relief. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in a long time, without nightmares or terrifying sounds. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight streamed into the house, I knew that the darkness had finally retreated. I knew the basement would remain locked forever. I would board up the door and never go down there again. And although the memories of what happened would haunt me for a long time, I knew I would no longer let fear control my life. Since then, the house seemed different. I began to notice that it had become brighter and cozier. The sounds that once scared me no longer disturbed me. I realized that the darkness I had defeated was not only in the basement, but also in my own heart. This experience changed me forever. I was no longer afraid of the unknown because I knew that willpower and light could overcome even the deepest fears. And although I would never open the basement door again, I knew that now I could face any evil that tried to enter my life.